All right, welcome back to it. We are going to look this time at TypeScript and hooks. Let's get right into it. Okay, so I'm going to go and in my temp directory, create a new project called TS Hooks. And I'll use yarn create for that with React app. And then I'll do TS Hooks. And then I'll give it the TypeScript template. And that's going to create a TypeScript project for us. Pretty much the usual sort of thing, the spinning React logo with, just in TypeScript as opposed to JavaScript. So another thing I'm also going to do in this is put a few little touches on last week's video around basic component stuff in TypeScript, just to make sure. I got some great feedback on that, and I just want to pass it on to you to make sure that you know everything you should about how to do TypeScript components. Nothing really, no big changes, I would say. Just, some little touches, some ways to use const as opposed to using function, and then also how to export the props as an interface. So, okay, let's go jump into VS Code on this. And we'll start it up. Okay, looking pretty good. We got our spinning React logo. It's time to go make a few visual changes just so we can have something easy to work with. I'm going to remove all this stuff, all the boilerplate. Get rid of this. Don't need any of that. And then over, you know what, I'll go in and add in like a hello world. And then over in the index.css, I'll move it into the center of the screen. I'll make it max width of 800 pixels. And then put a little padding on it. And then make the font size extra large, just so we can see it. Let's go take a look. All right, there you go. Hello world, ta-da, cool. So what I'm going to cover in this is I'm going to cover useState, useEffect, useContext, useReducer, and useMemo and useRef. Use callback, there's not a lot of typing to do with that. There's actually not a lot of typing to do with useEffect, but you'll see as we get there. I just want to make sure that you have a pretty solid foundation of these, and we'll do a custom hook as well and show how to put some types on that. And as I said, we'll go and talk about the React component stuff and make sure that you've got all your bases covered on that. Okay, so let's go and do state stuff. So I'll create some headings here so we can kind of see on the page each different sections. So I'll do useState, and then I'm going to create a component for each one of these sections. So we'll call this useState component. And all right, so I'm going to go and create a new component. Call it useState component. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is create an array and then have a way to push items into that array. I'm going to have a button that pushes items into the array and then have the array. So I need to create some state, right? So let's go create some state. I'm going to import useState from React. And let's go down into here, and I'll say that we have an array and an array set. Now, some of the feedback I got was, hey, don't you use set array? You can use either. I use array set, and the reason is that I like to be able to go and grab this and actually have both of them selected simultaneously using extend selection, Command D. Really up to you. useState, and it's an array, right? So just start off with an array. Cool. And I'll go here. Let's say, so we're going to have two different examples here. So the first one will be that array, and I'll create a button, say add to array. And then I'll have the array. So put in here a JSON stringified array, right? And so what is this thing going to do on click? It's going to do an array set. And it's going to take the original array and then just add the length to it, you know, just so it starts off as nothing, then you get 1 and 2 and 3. Okay, so it's telling us it doesn't like this. So why doesn't it like that? Well, saying the argument of type number is not assignable to a parameter of set action, state action, whatever that is, never. In other words, type number is not assignable to never. Well, where'd you get never from? I didn't say never. Well, what happens is that when useState looks to see what this value is, because that's the only way that it knows anything about typing on this, it comes up with never, right? An array that would just be that empty array forever and ever and ever. It's kind of weird. So the way that you coerce useState to say that this is going to be an array of numbers is you do less than, and then number, an array, and then greater than. And that's basically saying, okay, so I know that you're looking for a type in this. I know that you're looking to infer the type from this value. What it really is an array of numbers. And this trips people up a lot, this kind of array thing here. And there's one more variant that I'll show you that also trips folks up. But let's make sure this works for first. So let's go and copy that and then export that as the default. Now we got to import it over here. How smart are you going to be? No, you're not going to be very smart about that. Okay, so we're going to need to import it. Okay, let's try this out. Hey, it looks pretty good. Okay, all right. So the other one that trips folks up is, let's say that I want to have a variable that starts off as null and then maybe gets set to a string. So let's do that. So I'm going to say name and name set. And again, I'm going to start this off with null because when it boots, it should be in the null state. So copy that, and then I'm going to say I want to set the name to Jack. Like that. Call this set name. And then over here, we're going to JSON string file. Well, I'll just put in the name. You know, or there you go. Let's put that in there. So it'll tell us whether it's null or not. But again, it's saying we got a problem with this. This argument of type Jack is not assignable to a parameter of type set state action null, right? So it's saying, hey, in this case, the only thing I know about this, I'm not a mind reader. I can't tell that what you want in there is a string or a null. So again, we'll use less than and then string or null. And there you go. So there we go. So this is really good when you are working with, say, a payload that you're getting back from a server. It's going to be null if you don't have the payload yet, or it's going to be whatever the payload type is if you get that. And so you're going to have the payload type in here and then null or undefined, whatever you want, however you want to play it in there. So, all right, let's go back over here. Set same. Oh, perfect. Okay, so looks like everything's working. Okay. I think that's kind of the basics of useState. Let's jump on to useEffect. So I'm going to go and create another one here called useEffect. And then we'll have a useEffect component that we're going to build out. So let's go and create a new file, useEffect component. And again, we'll create a useEffect component. And we'll export that. So we're going to need useState, and we're going to need useEffect. So useState, and also useEffect. So I'm going to build a timer, and we're going to learn a couple of things from that. We're going to learn one about the typing on useEffect, which is not much. And then we're also going to learn about how to build a timer that doesn't blow up. So, okay. So the first thing we need to do is have a value in here. And also that setter. We use useState for that, and we'll start it off with 1. Why not? And then we'll go in here and just put div val. Pretty easy. So now we need our useEffect. So let's go bring in useEffect. And let's go check out the typing on this. So hit right-click on that, hit go to definition, and over here you get the definition for it. Okay, so right away we notice that there's nothing like T in there. I shouldn't really edit that, but okay. But what we do have is this effect callback. So let's go to the definition of that, and just to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So basically, what this is telling us is that useEffect takes a function, and that function either returns a void or it returns a function that in turn returns either void or undefined. Okay, so let's do that. So let's go create that function. And we're only going to run it on startup, which means that our dependency array, which is the second thing in there, is going to be an empty array. And then within that, we're going to say we want a window, set interval, which is how you do it, timer. And that in turn also takes a function, confusingly. And val set. And naively, we're just going to say, hey, okay, we got a timer callback. Let's go and do that val +1. We don't want it to happen incredibly fast, so let's go and put in 1,000 in here. Just make sure that it's 1,000 milliseconds to a second, so this is only going to fire every second. And we're going to save that out. And so there's 2 issues in here. So, all right, we didn't actually bring this in yet, so let's go do that. useEffect component. And then drop that in there. Okay, so interestingly, it goes from 1 and then it goes to 2, and it stops. So why does it do that? Well, so that's an interesting thing about this. So let me get rid of a few of these things, just so we can kind of concentrate on the code here. So what's happening is that this is what's called a closure, and it's actually capturing the state of val the one and only time this is ever run. So useEffect runs. It then sets up this window set interval, it passes it a function, and says, well, what's the value of val at this point, which is actually 1, right? And so it says, great, okay, so this is essentially stuck on 1 forever. So the way that we fix that is we do v, and we make it a function. So we say v equals v plus 1, or it's a function now, because this setter, we got back from useState, can either take an actual value or it can take a function, and that function gives you the current value, and then you can mutate it. So in this case, the current value comes in as v, and then it does v plus 1. So let's save that out. And now 1, 2, 3. So that's working. We fixed that bug. But there's one more little sinister bug in here that we haven't fixed, which is that this set interval never gets cleared. So there's a clear that needs to happen. So the way that you do that is you grab the timer handle, basically. And then remember how over here in useEffect, if I went in here and it said the effect callback can either return nothing, which is what we were doing before, or it can return a function that returns void or undefined. Well, that's what we're going to do in this case. And that function is a cleanup function. So we're going to do return, and we're going to return the cleanup function. So this basically tells React, hey, when you get rid of this component, make sure to run this little function on the way out the door to just clean everything up, and then it'll be fine. So in that case, the way you clean it up is you say window.clear interval, and then you give it that timer. So there you go. There's a cheap and easy way to do a nice timer that actually does the timer thing and also cleans itself up when it's no longer needed. So let's go back over here to our, looks like it's going pretty well there. Okay. Alrighty. So let's talk about useContext next. That's another cool one. So let's go and look at our list of hooks APIs. So we've got useState so far. We covered that. We covered useEffect. Now let's cover useContext. So If you're not familiar with useContext, it's a way of passing data around the whole tree without prop drilling. So prop drilling is when you take state from a parent component and you drill it down into the components below it. This allows you to, context allows you to go and pass around that state without actually having to prop drill. So let's bring back our files, create a new file called useContext component. And there's a bunch of things I need here. So first off, we have to create a context. So the way that we do this normally is we actually externalize this because you're going to have context shared between multiple components. So you really are creating what's essentially a store. So let's go actually create a store file. Again, we'll use TS for TypeScript. And from React, in this case, we're going to bring in create context. Like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up our initial states. We're going to say const initial state. And this will hold, say, first name and last name. Okay, and then we're going to go and create some context. So we'll say context is create context, and then we'll give it the initial state. Now that actually does do the type inference. It figures that out. So if, for example, if I go over here to the definition, we can see that create context takes a default value and that becomes the type because it returns then the context for that type. But you know, hey, let's actually be a little bit more systematic about it. So the way that I would do that is, well, I don't have a type for this. I haven't declared one. So what I can do is I can say type of, and then give it the initial state. And that basically says, okay, I want, this as my type. All right, let's go and export that context. And we'll go back over here and we'll import, let's call it user context. And now I want to have a couple of components because I want to kind of sprinkle stuff around. So I'm going to have the top level component. We'll call that again useContext component. And what it needs to do is it needs to provide that context down the tree. So if I go under user context, I see, haha, I've got this provider thing. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to provide my context down the tree. But what it needs is it needs a value. So it needs a value to provide down that tree. Now, there is the default value that comes in, but I want to provide my own value. So I'm going to go and, again, use useState to track and provide that value. So we'll call that user. And that's going to go into that value like that. And I'll say, okay, great. I want state, but how do I know what's that is supposed to be? So I need to know the structure of this thing that I want to provide down to all my components. I'm going to go back over here to useEffect to the store. Let's get rid of useEffect components. I don't confuse ourselves, and we'll go over here to initial state. And actually, I really want to export this. I want to export the type of this because I want my state to match the schema of this particular thing. So I'm going to say export a new type. We'll call it user state. And we'll just give it the type of initial state. And now this user state can be used to define the shape that I want from useState. So I'll bring that over here. User state, and then using greater than, less than. Now I can say great. So useState, in this case, is supposed to be one of these user states. So if I jump in here and I hit Command space, oh, there we go. It's gonna be a first. So it says, Jane, last name is Smith. There you go. And it seems happy. Everybody seems happy. That's great. Cool. Okay. So let's go and actually now consume this somewhere. So I need a subcomponent that's going to go grab this. So we'll call that consumer component. This is the component that's going to consume that context. And this is where I'm going to use useContext. Finally, after all this, we're going to finally use useContext. So I'm going to go get user from useContext, but I have to give it this user context so that it knows which context to get it from. Well, let's go get this from React first. useContext, pop that in there, and then I'll just put a nice little div. What's React if it's not multiple nested divs? First is user dot, and check that out. So immediately, useContext, because it knows it's coming in with user context, it knows what the structure is of this thing. Now, I could, if I wanted to, I could say useContext like that. I could say that. That's fine too. And look, everything's fine now. So it's still happy with that, right? But it's inferred, which is probably okay. But let's do that. That's fine. I'll do first. And last. All right, now let's export this. And finally bring it into our app. Call this useContext. useContext component. If you want to know how I did that, by the way, so let me undo that here. I started with useEffect component on that third line, hit Command D, and then I just typed in useContext component, and away we go. Let's take a look. Well, that's because I haven't actually used this, so let's go bring in that consumer component, drop it in there. Save it, and there we go. First is Jane Smith, and away we go. Cool, nice. All right. So let me just go and add a button to that so we can change that. So I'll show you how that's done. Call it change context. Provide a click handler, and then set that user to, I don't know, Josie Smith, Josie Wales. I don't know, who knows? Okay. And now click on that, change the name, away you go. Cool, nice. So notice that we haven't done any prop drilling between consumer component and this state is automatically being essentially transmitted through that context down into that consumer component. And when that context changes, it automatically updates the consumer component, and away you go. So let's see, is there any, I think this is actually pretty good as a place to end on useContext. I'm sure there are a few more variations in there, but maybe I'll address those in a later video. Okay, so what else we got? Ooh, we got useReducer. So this is an interesting one because I'm not going to go into state managers in this video, but in a later video, we're going to talk about Redux, and actually a lot of what we would do in Redux, we're going to do right now as we talk about useReducer. So let us go and create yet another slot for useReducer and get ready to create our useReducer component. So let's go here, useReducer component. Okay. So when you do a useReducer, why would you do a useReducer? That's a really good question. Well, you'd use a useReducer just like you would use useState, except that if you've got complex state, so you've got a state that has multiple things in it, then that's when you want to use something like a useReducer. But I'm not going to do that necessarily in this case. I'm just going to create something pretty simple. So I'm going to create an initial state. It is a counter. It starts at 100. And then there's going to be two different actions that I can apply to this state. I want to be able to increment it or decrement it. And so what I'm going to do is going to define a type. We'll call it action types. And we're going to say that it's either type of increment with a payload of a number, or it's decrement with a payload of a number. And then I'm going to create a reducer. We'll call it counter reducer. And it takes two things. It takes a state, which is the type of the initial state. And then it takes an action, which is a type of action type. I'm going to get rid of the equals there because that's not syntactically correct. And now I want to switch on the action type. So I hit dot there. It knows because from this action that it's either going to be action payload in this case or action type. I'll do that. And then when you switch, you have to give it a bunch of cases. So let's see, case. Aha, this is cool. So this is actually where TypeScript is helping us because we've done this work. So this is telling us, cool, well, you're switching on action type. And I know that action type actually has to be either an increment or a decrement. So let's do increment first. And then the contract of one of these is that it needs to return the updated state. So that's going to be everything is currently in state, but with the counter set to the state counter plus, because it's an increment, the action payload. All right, and then we'll do the same thing for decrement, except that it's minus. And then finally, you need a default. So the default in this case, we're going to just throw a new error that says bad action. We didn't know what you're talking about. So, okay. All right. So it's giving us a little, what's the problem? useReducer can be compiled. Okay. Counter reducer never used. Okay. So let's go and use all this stuff. So let's go and create our new useReducer function, useReducer component. All right, so we'll start off by creating that useReducer. And what you get back from useReducer is you get a state, and then you get a dispatch. And then you use useReducer. See if it, did it import it? Oh my gosh, it did. Finally it did. Doesn't always. So what does a useReducer take? It takes a reducer. Hey, we got one of those. We got this guy, counter reducer. So let's drop that in there. And then it takes an initial state. And we got one of those too. That's the initial state up here. Pretty cool. All right. Let's now go and build a UI around this. Our usual divs. And the first thing we want to do is show the count. There you go. And then we want to have some buttons. Button, who's got the button? So we'll say increment. And we'll give it an on-click. And now we're going to use this dispatch because we want to dispatch an action, which is going to be one of these action types, to our reducer. So let's go dispatch. And now, ooh, look at this. Cool. It's automatically telling us type should be either increment or decrement. So let's do that. Let's do type, and then what? Oh, wow. That's nice. It even did that. So payload. Let's do 10 up. Every time you hit increment, we go up by 10. All right. And I'll put a little pipe in there, and then I'll have a decrement. Let's get hinted again. Yep, there we go, decrement. And this one we want to decrement by 5. So let's do decrement there. It's a long file, but it's not actually doing all that much. Just kind of, that's the way Prettier likes to lay it out. Okay, so all we need to do now is export this, export default. And then go back over here to app.tsx, and we'll drop that in there. And of course, it's not going to go and auto import it for us. So let's go and bring it in like that. Now let's see how we go. Oh, pretty good so far. So let's increment it. Oh, yeah, there you go. Nice. Pretty cool. Okay. So obviously, this is not, let's go to a few files here. This is not all that much in terms of complexity. But you can imagine where you've got an initial state that's fairly complex. It's got a whole bunch of different values in it. And you've got a whole bunch of different action types. So that this is basically sort of when useState kind of runs out of gas, that's where useReducer comes into play. So, and if you can actually see that, it's written up in the documentation as well. So here you go to definition. It says, there you go. So useReducer is usually preferable to useState when you have complex state logic that includes, probably off the screen, multiple sub-values. So there you go. It's pretty much, honestly, it's basically Redux built into React. All right, let's continue on. So we've covered useState, useEffect, useContext, useReducer. Let's talk about a custom hook, or actually, let's talk about useRef first, and then we'll talk about a custom hook and useMemo. So useRef isn't all that big of a deal. It's really just typing the type that you expect from the reference, but let's go check it out anyway. Close that out. Call this useRef, and we'll create a new component, useRef component. You know, you don't often use references or use, for usually you're keeping track of an actual HTML component, or you've got some type of current data, like a handle you just want to hold on to, but you don't necessarily want to re-render when you change it. All right, here we go. So we'll bring in useRef, and we'll create a new component. And it's going to have like an input field in it. And we just want to get a handle onto that input component. So we use input ref, and then we use useRef, and we start off with null. And then we say that the reference to that particular input component, then this is going to actually hold the actual HTML DOM element is input ref. And the only thing you need to do we don't need to do it, and it's doing it automatically for us at this point, is you can define what this input ref is going to be, and that would be an HTML input element because it's an input, or null. That's how you're going to define that useRef. This is actually covered in some detail over in the cheat sheet. And this is basically a sort of practical look at how you get this to work. So you can use useRef for other things, but this is, I would say the primary use case of it. So save that off. This is really not going to see anything interesting here, but I'll just put it on the screen just because. And you can also grab this component, or this code from GitHub, check it out for yourself, play with it. Yeah, there you go. So a nice typed version of useRef over there. Cool. All right, so let's talk about custom hooks. So I want to have a new file. We'll call it custom hook component. And we'll talk about how to type custom hooks. So I'm going to go grab my new favorite data set, and that's the Happy Valley Growlers list. This will go into the public directory. Happy Valley is where I live, and there's these growler stores where you can go get growlers filled with whatever you want, beer, wine, cola, whatever. And this will be a list of all their taps. So let's go back in there, and it's just a nice data set. So we're going to go and use a fetch. We're going to create a custom fetch hook to go and grab this data and put it into our component. So let's go build the component first. So I'll create a custom hook component. All right, and we'll export that. And so now we want to go get the data. So instead of just going and using useEffect and useState, we're going to go and create our own get beverage data hook, right? So I'm going to create a new function for that. Call it use fetch data. And I'll take a URL, which will be a string. And it's going to have a couple of things. It's going to have a useState, it's going to have data, and it's going to have done. So let's whether it's gotten the data back and whether it's done. So let's go and import those. So we're going to need a useState and useEffect. So the first one is the data. And now it's going to start off as null. So this gets us back to that useState null thing. So we got to watch out for that. Oh, let's go get this syntactically correct first. There we go. Cool. And then we're going to have done. We'll call that false because it starts off and hadn't gotten the data yet. So let's go fetch that data. And to do that, I'm going to use a useEffect. And we'll go fetch that URL. And then we'll convert the response to JSON. And then once we have the data back, we will set the data. We'll call that D, just make it easy on ourselves. We'll set the data. And we'll also set done to true. Now we only want to run this when the URL changes. So we'll put the URL in there as a list of dependencies. Cool. And then we'll return the data and the done. Neat. Okay, cool. Now we really want this to be typed. So I'm going to go over here to happyvalleytaplist.json. I'm going to go and copy, Command C, this. And I'm going to use this really cool extension not built in, but I added it on to VS Code that converts anything that's in the JSON in the clipboard as JSON into a TypeScript interface. It looks at the JSON and says, "Oh, what are the types in there?" And there you go. So I'm going to run that now. This convert JSON clipboard to TypeScript interfaces, and cool. So if I look at this root object matches this, right? So strings and numbers and all that good stuff. So, but that's not really, root object isn't a great name for it, so we'll call it beverage. And this guy is going to be an array of beverages or null, right? Because that's really what we want. We're going to get an array of beverages off this fetch data. And then this guy is going to be that beverage array. Cool, nice, all right. And so what this is going to do is it's going to return data which is a beverage array, and done, which is a Boolean, like that. Well, let's try it out. Let's see if this actually works or not. Well, hold on. So what do we got here? So data, oh, I see. Or null, right? Okay, so that's why that was a problem. So let's go do this. Let's go do the fetch data. We'll say data and done is using our cool new custom hook called fetch data. And we're going to go to grab HV tap list.json, which is the same thing as what's over here in public. Save that out. And now we'll say if we're done, then I want to put out a, let's see. So an image, because there's this really cool logo in there, right? So I'm going to say that this is the alt is going to be the beverage image, beverage logo. And what's the source going to be? Well, the source is going to be the data 0 dot. Ooh, check that out, because it knows that I'm getting back an array of beverages. It knows all of the different things in there. So I'm going to say logo. Now I know, and you and I know, that done means that this is not going to be empty if it's done. So I'm going to put in a bang there, exclamation point, and that's going to tell it, hey, no, it's cool. Don't worry about it. I'm going to guarantee that that's in there. All right, let's see if this actually works. So I'll go over here to useRef. We'll call this custom hook component. Custom hook. All right, let's try it out. Let's see if this worked or not. Whoa, right away. That's pretty cool. Okay, custom hook, so cool. All right, so we've got now our logo in there of the first one in the list. We can have some fun and say that, the second one, let's look at what the second logo is. Nice, okay, cool. So that's neat. All right, let's go back to the 0th logo. So a couple of things about this. One, this is really cool. And what happens if I want to go and actually make this generic, right? So I want to compete with Tanner Inslee's use query, and I think we got a good starting point here. So how do we do that? Well, one thing we can do is we can say, well, let's go and take everywhere where beverage is, which is just those 3 spots, and I'm just gonna say that's payload, whatever that is. It's gonna be the payload, and I'm gonna put in here payload. So I'm making it now a generic function, and that's pretty cool. But now down in here, it doesn't understand, like, whoa, I don't know, we've lost all notion of what this is. So you didn't tell me anywhere where that's a beverage. So I'm going to go grab that beverage again, scoot down here to use fetch data, and once again, open and close those greater than less thans, and put in that it's of a type beverage. And now, this is a generic function. This is really neat. So I can point this at any data set, anywhere. And as long as I can give it the output, what I expect to see from it, it's going to go and automatically do all the coercion. And that's just really cool. So let's talk, and that's basically how to do the custom hook stuff, but it kind of works with useMemo as well. So I want to talk about a little bit about useMemo. There we go. So there was an issue there for a little bit, but now it isn't. useMemo, cool. And that's the last one I'm going to cover before we get into little touch-ups on the component stuff. So, okay, so useMemo. So let me go walk through a little use case here. So I'm going to say that we want only the Portland taps. So we've got our list of beverages, but we only want to show the ones that are from Portland. So Portland taps. And I'm going to use useMemo for this. I'm going to use memo. And what useMemo does, it takes a factory method. It doesn't take any inputs at all. And it returns some data. So in this case, I'm going to say that it's based on the data or an empty array. And I'm just going to filter that array just down to the Portland item. So filter. And now notice, right, it already is hinting to me that the value here is going to be a beverage because the array of data is a beverage. So let's say that that's a bev. And now as I do bev dot, I'm starting to see some cool stuff. So I got producer location there. That's probably what I want. I want to say includes, and then Portland. And then the next thing I need to do when it comes to useMemo is tell it what data is going to change. It's going to trigger me to actually rerun this CPU compute intensive function. In this case, it's just data. So whenever data changes, right, we're going to then go and recompute Portland taps. So I'll drop that in there for the data. I'm just going to show the first Portland one. And I can now change done to like something like Portland taps.length. So when length is greater than 0, then we automatically show it. And let's save. And boom. Okay, I guess that's the first Portland beverage. I certainly hope so. So I think it is, honestly. Yeah, if we go over here, yeah, this is in Portland, Oregon. Let's see, are there other ones? There's Papyrus Iris. That's a great name. All right, so there we go. Let's put in one there. What does Papyrus Iris look like? Oh, that's a good looking logo there. All right, so what have we gotten through so far? We've gotten through a couple of variations of useState, useEffect, useContext, useReducer, useMemo, useRef, all that good stuff. Okay, well, let's talk about last week's video and some of the user feedback that I got that is particularly relevant here, or I want to clean up a little bit. So let's just clean up a few of those things. Call it even more React component. Even more React component stuff. Create a new file for that. Even more. All right, so there were a few things that I wanted to go over, and the first one was that I showed how to define props, but I didn't show how to export the interface of a set of props for a particular component. And I think that's worth going over. So the first one that I did was I did a heading component, which took a title, and that title was defined as a string. All right, pretty clear. And the criticism I got was, hey, by the way, you really should go and export that as its own props. So let's just say that I want to export this heading. I want to export a default here as well. So I'm going to say, test component. And we'll return a heading with the title. Hello. Like that. And I'll export that as the default. So let's go back over here. So another nice thing to do would be to say export interface and then say heading props. Put those together really. And there you go. So this is a good thing to do. It's absolutely a great idea. I'm sorry I didn't mention it last time. Absolutely worth doing. Let's go and check it out. Does it work? Yes. Hello. Perfect. Let's change it to like an H2 or something like that, or an H3 so I can visually tell the difference. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Great. So yeah, no, this is a really good idea for sure. And the second piece of feedback that I got was, why do you do functions? Why not just do const? So in this case, you can do that for sure. Absolutely. So you can do const and then do equals and equals greater than, and that's fine too. So whichever way you want to roll with that, that's fine. And then the other was around specifically generics and const. So let me go and kind of reproduce what we had originally. So we had a list generic function that would take a list of items, and we'll call this list item. And it would take an array of those. And then it would also take a render function. And that render function, well, let me get this to save so that it's nice and spread out, or not. And that render function would take an item, which is also defined as a list item, and return a React node for that. Now, are you going to import that for me? Oh, it did. Oh, thank you. So sweet. Okay. And we'll go and return out a unordered list of items, where we get the item and then the index. And then we do a list item. And within that, then we call back that render function with the item. And we give it the key of the index. Yeah, and it's just a nice generic way of doing lists. So if you want to see this actually run, let's go and make this a fragment or a div or something. So we'll get a list. Its items are A, B, and C. As easy as 1, 2, 3. And the one thing that we're missing is a render function. So we'll give it a render. And we'll say for any given string, output, I don't know, strong with the string in the middle of it. All right, let's go take a look. There you go. A, B, C. Nice. Okay, so the other piece of feedback that I got was, hey, this function and thing is really cool. Can you do this as a const? I really dig on the const flavor of defining my functions, my components, and of course you can. It's just a little bit twistier, I would say, in terms of its implementation. So let's go, so we got the const, right? And we're going to say this. We're going to define the variable name, list, and then let's see. So all this works. But now we have to define the return type. So React node. That's what it's going to return. And then we need to define the implementation. So we're going to do items and render. And then again, another dash greater than. And there you go. So there's the constant variant of that. But I got to say, to my eye, that's actually pretty hard to read. So I'm going to go and grab this and say this is a new type called list component and equate it to that. And then this just becomes list component. And I think that's just a little bit easier to read, I would say. And then we can also, of course, export that as a type as well if you want to have somebody else derive from that. So, pretty clean interface there. So hopefully that helps out when it comes to functions and generics. Wow. That was a big video, the longest edited video I think I've ever put up on YouTube. Really excited about it, though, and I hope that you have gotten a lot out of it in terms of being more comfortable now with hooks and TypeScript and how they work together to make a more type-safe code base, one that's easier to work on, and you get all that hinting and all those other great benefits that you get from TypeScript. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put those in the comment section down below, or you can go on the Discord server that's linked to in the description, jump on the #TypeScript channel and jump on in, ask any questions, and hopefully the community, myself included, will help you on out with that. In the meantime, of course, feel free to like and share this video with your friends. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But in the meantime, from me to you, be happy, be healthy, and be safe.